The aging quantum historian stepped carefully over the crumbling rubble of what had once been the Grand Cathedral of Justice. In the weak light of the three moons, Dr. Ariana Chen could just make out the faded inscription etched into the fallen marble, "Equal justice under law." She shuddered, adjusting her hood to hide her face from the ever-present drones that hummed overhead. Nobody used their real names anymore. To the Unified Surveillance Authority, she was simply Citizen 12-98A3. "You're late," came a voice from the shadows. A figure emerged, tall, thin, dressed in the synthetic grey uniform of the Information Ministry. Her contact, Nordia Trusp, an undersecretary with access to the historical archives that had been scrubbed from the public neurosphere decades ago. "The checkpoints were thorough tonight," Ariana replied. Anniversary preparations. Tomorrow marked 50 years since the Great Reformation of the Unified Sovereign Alliance, the day when Dan Lupmot had protected democracy by declaring it obsolete. The Supreme Patriot, they called him now. His diamond-encrusted statue dominated every city square, his piercing blue gaze replaced with rubies that glowed red at night, watching the citizens he claimed to protect. "I have what you asked for," said Nordia, glancing nervously at the sky. "But accessing these files triggered alerts. We don't have much time." She pressed a small crystal data node into Ariana's palm. "The true history, before the purges." Ariana's fingers closed around the device. Her life's work, reconstructing how the USA, once the beacon of liberty for the world, had descended into the authoritarian nightmare now known as the Patriot State. "You should know," Nordia whispered, "there's a file in there about something called the 24 transition. That's when it all changed. When the institution stopped functioning." A drone swooped lower, its scanning beam sweeping the ruins. They ducked behind a fallen column. "I have to go," Nordia said. "Remember what we agreed, truth is the only weapon we have left." Ariana nodded, watching her contact disappear into the darkness. The risk they both took was immeasurable. The punishment for historical sabotage, the crime of questioning the official narrative, was extraction of memory centers in the brain, leaving behind a shell of a person who could still work but would never again question authority. She waited 10 minutes before emerging from her hiding place, taking a circuitous route back to her living pod in Sector 7. The streets were emptier than usual, most citizens were home preparing for tomorrow's mandatory celebrations. Giant holographic banners hung between buildings, 50 years of perfect unity and the Supreme Patriot protects. Beneath each banner, smaller projections displayed the daily loyalty score leaderboard, where citizens competed to demonstrate their patriotism through monitored speech, consumption, and social behavior. At a checkpoint, Ariana presented her wrist to a scanner. The guard, a hulking man with a cybernetic eye replacement that constantly recorded and analyzed facial expressions, studied her biometric readout. "Your heart rate is elevated, Citizen 12-98A3, he said flatly. "Anniversary excitement," she replied with a practiced smile. "I'm leading the educational programming at the Heritage Academy tomorrow." The guard nodded. Her position as a historian, carefully vetted and approved to teach the sanctioned version of history, afforded her a level of movement others lacked. The irony wasn't lost on her, the regime had entrusted its lies to someone dedicated to uncovering truth. "Proceed," the guard said, waving her through. In her sparse living pod, a 12 by 15 foot space allocated based on her citizen value score, Ariana finally allowed herself to breathe. Her hands shook as she removed the data node from a hidden pocket in her sleeve. She activated her personal shield generator, a black market device that created a small bubble impervious to the standard surveillance feeds. She inserted the data node into her reader. The files illuminated the wall with images from another era. Crowds in the streets, waving flags. Historic buildings teeming with people in formal attire. Leaders debating in great halls. And then, a shift. Larger and larger rallies, all centered around a single figure, Dan Lupmot, with his signature white blonde hair and orange-tinted skin. The imagery was jarring. How could someone so clearly unqualified rise to such power? She accessed the analysis files. It had begun with economic anxiety after the climate corrections of the early 21st century. Rural and industrial regions had suffered as the old economy died. Rather than embrace transition, they turned to nostalgia, a promise to return to a mythical golden age. Lapmot had seized on this, blaming outsiders and coastal elites. The file labeled 24 Transition detailed the breaking point, an election where Lapmot, having lost once before, refused to concede defeat. His followers attacked the capital sanctuary. When he regained power in the chaos that followed, he systematically dismantled the checks that had constrained him. The judiciary was purged, filled with loyalists. The legislative body was intimidated into compliance. The free press was branded enemy of the people and gradually replaced with state-approved truth-casters. Ariana's eyes widened as she read about the Constitutional Convention of 2026, where Lapmot supporters had rewritten the foundational document to expand executive power and remove term limits. The voices of opposition had been drowned out by accusations of treason. The file continued, the genius of Lapmot's strategy was its incremental nature. Each outrage numbed the public to the next. When resistance arose, it was met with overwhelming force, justified as he maintaining order. The deployment of the National Guard in 12 cities marked the end of effective resistance. The screen flickered as a new file opened, a collection of profiles labeled the enablers. Baal Markar, the technology magnate who had provided the surveillance infrastructure in exchange for market dominance. Senator Mig Comgnal, who had abandoned principle for political survival. General Walt Lilmsley, who turned the military inward against domestic enemies. Hours passed as Ariana devoured the forbidden history. The creation of the Citizen Loyalty Score. The National Genetic Registry. The Information Purification Act that had erased contrary viewpoints from the public record. The voluntary biometric implants that had become mandatory for accessing basic services, but most disturbing were the records of the resistance, those who had fought back against the rising tide of authoritarianism. Their names had been systematically erased from official history, replaced with caricatures of terrorists and traitors. Yet here were their true stories: judges who had ruled against executive overreach until their courts were dissolved, journalists who had continued reporting until they were arrested for information terrorism, generals who had refused unconstitutional orders and were subsequently court-martialed. Ariana paused on one particular file, a woman named Julia Chen, a constitutional lawyer who had organized underground networks to smuggle dissidents to safety in the early days of the purges. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same eyes Ariana saw in the mirror each morning, the same determined set of the jaw her grandmother. The woman she'd been told had died in a transportation accident when Ariana was just a child. She stared at the image, her hands trembling. The official family history she'd been given was a lie. Her grandmother hadn't been a loyal citizen who perished in an unfortunate accident. She had been a resistance leader who disappeared into the regime's detention system. A notification pulsed on her wristcom. Morning curfew would lift in 30 minutes. She had to report to her teaching position at the National Heritage Academy, where she dutifully recited the approved version of history to her students, but today would be different. She couldn't unknow what she now knew. The Republic hadn't fallen in a day. It had been eroded, drip, by people who valued power over principle. And her own blood had fought against it. She thought of her students, especially Elias, a bright boy who asked too many questions for his own good. His family had already been flagged for patriotic re-education once. Could she risk bringing him into this? Ariana closed the files and removed the data node, hiding it in a compartment beneath her floorboards. The truth was more dangerous than any weapon in the arsenal of the Patriot state. But it was also the only hope for a people who had forgotten what freedom meant. As she prepared for her day, Ariana made a decision. She would no longer be merely a custodian of forbidden knowledge. Like her grandmother before her, she would become its messenger for the first time in years. Dr. Ariana Chen felt something long dormant stirring within her, a sense of purpose that transcended survival. If democracy had died by 1,000 cuts, perhaps it could be reborn through 1,000 whispered truths. She stepped outside her pod into the harsh morning light, the weight of history on her shoulders and a dangerous resolve in her heart.